Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love and Wilfred Reilly.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love. I am being joined by Christy, our West Coast connection, our comedian, the Lou Perez, and the other guy who's normally the person I introduce first, but he happens to be our guest this week. I guess probably our most frequent and our most well-liked guest, Professor Wilfred Reilly, here to discuss his latest book, Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me. Well, welcome to the show.
Good to be on, guys.
Welcome home.
The quality of celebrities you guys are getting is dropping off. I mean, I will say.
We could get no one else, so we decided to talk to you.
It brought me back in an alternate role, but glad to be on.
Well, I'm glad to have you to talk about the book. I gotta say that it's interesting reading on two levels. I'll do the second one later, but one is reading and thinking about how people would assess and go through this book and listen to these lies as we talk about them, not all of them, but a lot of them pretty frequently. So I'm like, I wonder how other these people in the dark ages who don't know what's going on are taking it. So it's interesting. So talk about why you wrote that, obviously the spin on the past classic, and why you thought this was a good time to talk about these lies.
Yeah, so I wrote this, I guess there are kind of two or three stages here. So I wrote this book in response to a whole genre of other books that for the parents out there, the people that are educators out there, you've probably seen and run into. And I mean, the classic example, kind of the big hoss in the room, is Lee Owen's book, Lies My Teacher Told Me, which is this very famous book that argues that American education is what he calls jingoistic. It teaches you from the right all these things about the country that aren't true. There weren't Native American Indians here, and the ones that did exist were very uncivilized, that sort of thing. So on down the line. I don't need to go through everything the competition said, but that's one of a number of books like this. I mean, there's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, A Native History of the United States and the Lies You Were Told, which is almost literally like a litany of the battles the Native Americans lost in the war against the white incomers. And the author is honest. I believe he's the son of a chief, but he just sort of doesn't list the Native victories, so you kind of wonder why the conflict took 400 years. And so that there's one of those texts. There's that old commie Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, where he tries to talk from the position of the oppressed in every conflict. So the Civil Wars, you would see it as a slave or as a blacksmith's boy marching south, and just really on and on. I mean, 1619, Charles, you and I have kind of professionally competed with them with 1776. But, their book, A Black History of the United States, and all this stuff. And I think looking at this from an academic's perspective, there are kind of two narratives that you get from pretty much all of these. One is that the Western world, like the European descent, English and Spanish, the kind of white majority, the American-led, however you want to look at it, the West, we all know what it means, is the worst culture in world history. Like, we had the slaves, we abused the women, we dropped the big bombs, we were terrible to the war captives, we are bad. People often say that the two defining facts of American life are that we won the war with the Indians and we had slaves. Not going to the moon, beating the Nazis, any of that. So that's point one. And point two is that you're kind of in the know and unique if you're aware of this. So textbooks will often say these kind of snarky little things like your parents probably don't know that much about feminism, or this may not be what you've learned in other books. So like you're kind of enlightened, you're edgy. Even when you think about the concept woke, what that means, you are woke, you're awake if you're aware of this. And my perspective reading through this stuff over the years and then reading through it comprehensively, prepping for this book, is that that's kind of nonsensical. First of all, Western culture is not any worse in historical comparison than any of the other great cultures. The kind of dorm room morality that we sometimes make fun of on this show, perhaps especially me, but also, I mean, like Lou, Charlie, almost everybody, is something that's existed for maybe 150 years. And that banter aside is probably mostly good. but that would have not occurred to Genghis Khan or Shaka Zulu or Thomas Jefferson or anyone else. It's a product of the combination of Christianity and the developed sciences, so on down the line. I talk about this in the book for anyone interested. But to say things like America had slaves, well, of course America had slaves, because until we developed farm machinery and, modern ethical laws about how to deal with the society that developed out of that, every country in the world had slaves. Of course there was abuse of people that we beat in war, because the Geneva Conventions were developed in 1949. That's when we signed the last one of them. So the West did the same things everybody else did. And in fact, we often did them less often than most other people. So I talk about Genghis Khan, for example, whose empire conquered China and Russia and India and the Middle East, and who's the direct lineal ancestor of something like 11% of the Asian, at least, men in the world, because he was such a prolific colonizer of other people's bodies, as Bill Maher once put it. And I go on from there to the advantages of the West. We emancipated the people that we did enslave, and so on down the line. But I think the second point is a little more important. The idea that you are a woke, edgy, interesting person, if you're aware of Marxism light or of feminism or something like that, is not accurate, because those are in fact the mainstream ideas in our society. And this is really pretty interesting. Like, the books I'm reading for this book aren't like Rebel Samizdat. They're not pages ripped from high school goth and hood kids' notebooks. They're the books that the school's assigning. Like, Black Lives Matter and the 1619 Project have formal curricula that you have to read if you're in school. So I'm looking at this from the perspective of the people telling you that they have these revolutionary ideas. The left wing of the Democratic Party and so on are currently running society. And I'm actually kind of on the outside. I mean, I'm pretty good. I'm not a broke man, but I'm a professor at a small college, analyzing these narratives and seeing whether what the people that are now in charge are saying is true. Like, who are they presenting as the boogeyman today? And all too often, by the way, it's sort of the ordinary citizen. And what I find is that a lot of what we're hearing today is in the exact opposite direction of the dangers that we're told to fear. And it's no more accurate than what students were told in the past. So I devote a chapter to kind of each of these things, like the unique evil of the West as represented by slavery, the peacefulness of Native Americans and other primitive societies, kind of the goodness of communism. So, I mean, one of the chapters points out that there never was really a Red Scare where the government sort of panicked about communism for no reason and started harassing innocent people. There actually were a ton of Russian spies in the United States, and we were chasing them around for pretty legitimate reasons. So I go through this, and I go through 6 or 7 other chapters, and I think the book's a useful resource and also not entirely boring.
All right. I want to ask you one quick question, and then I want to get a response from them. And based on what you said, I went out of order. I wasn't necessarily going to go in order, but you said something I thought was really important. So I jumped right down the bonus lie, number 10. Yeah. Lie 10 is the bonus lie, the continuing oppression narrative. And the reason I jumped to that is because when you started to explain why you talked about the books out the Zen Education Project, you talked about 1619, all that. And you said, and you talked about the lies my teacher told me, that original book that you kind of spoofed in a sense. And you said that they have this belief, I know it's laughable now, that American history and the narrative of Western civilization and everything we teach kids is being taught from the right. But the odd thing is, as much as they're putting all this stuff in the curriculum, aren't they kind of doing the same thing? Because aren't they saying the reason we need the 1619 projects in school, the reason we need to focus on equity, to invite Kendi to speak and all these people to talk about this and be equity force, everything we do it through a sense of DEI, is because they still believe that the country's not just that the country's, systemically racist, but they believe the system is an oppressive right-led system. And so just because they wrote a couple of books, it doesn't make a difference. So aren't they kind of still pushing things from that same narrative?
Yeah, I think they are. And it's really kind of bizarre and interesting because, like I said, the ideas that I'm critiquing are dominant or at very least of equal power in the United States. So, like the center left of the Democratic Party, the more left wing of our two parties, is in power. Like Joe Biden, or at least Joe Biden's handlers, is running the country. Yeah, I mean, if you looked up the most prominent people in Congress, I mean, you'd be AOC and the squad would be right up there. You know, Nancy Pelosi was until quite recently the Speaker of the House, so on down the line. And if you go into, and obviously there are Republican counterpoints of roughly equal power and so on. But I mean, if you go into media, if you go into academia, it gets far more extreme. I mean, like the stats I always drop, like Pew in 2004 actually took a look at the US national media. I mean, it's important not to exaggerate this, but they found that only 7% of national media journalists were to the right. So that would be like all the conservatives, but also all the libertarians. I think the center right would fall there. And the other 93% were on the left. I mean, it was Marxists, liberals, mostly left leaning moderates. I mean, so the moderates did fall in there, but in terms of position on abortion, gun rights, and so on, they were mostly to the left side of the middle. So, and that's not surprising given the national media is based in, New York, LA, Chicago, DC. And academia, I mean, is a little to the left of that. Let me see if I still have this graphic up on the Twitters from earlier today. But where's this thing? This is from the Rabbit Hole, who we've interviewed before. Elon Musk shared this. Oh, yeah. Figure one, number of Democratic faculty members for every Republican in 25 academic fields. This actually doesn't include the Marxists. This is just Democrats versus Republicans. So it'd actually be probably 10% more slanted than this. But okay, like psychology, 16.8 liberals for every conservative. History, 17.4 to 1. I'm not going to give all these, but like environment, 25.3 to 1. Theater 29.5 to 1, sociology 43.8 to 1,
Ooh.
English 48.3 to 1, religion 70 to 1. And then you get into anthropology, which is 56 to 0. So like there weren't any conservatives in the mix. It was like 56 to zero point 0.4 at the average college because you have small departments. So I mean, I think you have so I guess the point I'm making is you have an extremely disproportionate representation of these ideas in positions of power, to the extent that, like, I mean, I noticed I got invited to the Chicago Pride Parade this year. I'm probably not going to go, but I noticed that they have floats there that are sponsored by like the FBI and Halliburton. So this is the mainstream to like a striking degree. And the question then becomes like, what does the mainstream oppose? Like, do they now admit that they're in charge? Like, does that sort of center left that runs most of our institutions just say, like, okay, this isn't a patriarchy anymore. Like, women still take some individual abuse. But this is kind of a gynocratic country if you look at how boys are doing in school. Like, black people certainly aren't running the country, but we have affirmative action. We're trying to get the minorities up there. Like, is that admitted? No, not really. That's one of the things that's kind of weird that I kept stumbling into while I was writing the book. The boogeyman is sort of the same as it always was. It's kind of the racist patriarchy that's out there. But it's become diffused beyond the institutions because you can't really say that the colleges are racist patriarchies anymore. That they still try, but you can't really say the current president's a racist patriarch. It's more like every citizen has this devil in their heart, and if we give up for 1 second, they'll come back and they'll take all our power from us, and they'll throw us in camps and they'll put us back in the fields. But it's a weird dynamic. I guess that's what I'll say. Like the idea, there certainly isn't calm acceptance that things have changed.
Right. Christy Lou, who wants to go first? Christy Lou.
I guess I'll chime in. So how do your students react towards you, since you are, I would say, to the right? How
he's
do
not
they
at
react?
Columbia. He's in Kentucky.
But even still, I mean, they're not used to, a conservative, professor. I know I was a history major, and I was thinking about this. I won't name drop him, but he was Black, one of my, major Black history professors. And I remember when it got down to teaching us anything conservative, he always prefaced it like, we're going to do this really quick. And it was almost like a footnote. So with you being, I'm sure, more fair, how do your students react to you? Or do they even realize there's a difference because maybe you teach mostly freshmen? Or tell us a little bit about that.
So far, I haven't had any dramatic public difference whatsoever. I don't know. I mean, maybe there's some subtle backlash I'm not seeing or something like that. I really don't know, actually. I haven't encountered that much, if any, public hostility. And I think some of that might be because of the dichotomy between kind of regular life and what we see in media, what we see on television. So, like, when I see student rioting and so on, like, one of the things I notice is the line I use is it's always one of these, like, weird bespoke colleges that no one goes to. So it's always like Oberlin or Bowdoin or like the Claremont colleges in California. It's never like Florida before a football game or something like that. So at like Kentucky State or UK, I mean, there certainly are people that are passionate about Palestine, but they mostly seem to just discuss it before class and then go do their work and then go watch the basketball game or something. And I would tend to suspect that the majority of schools around the country where like the biggest major is engineering or nursing or something, that's probably the case. That like radicalism actually is really concentrated in the USA. Like that's one of the things that's actually kind of interesting. I wrote an article for commentary once called The Whiteness of Wokeness. And it was more than whiteness. It was like upper middle class, urban, like Ivy League or just shyness. So I went down all these like metrics that I was studying at that time for what almost became an academic journal article. Like, do you support political correctness? And for all of them, there was one group that did, and it was like left leaning, young, upper class, white women, with everyone else hating the idea. And I think that's what people mean on the right when they talk about like the longhouse. Like, there's this group of people that don't seem like they'd be very much fun to date, that have like really passionate opinions about restricting your behavior, that don't want you to talk about like X, Y, and Z. Like that, I think would be the group that's very censorious on the left. There probably are other groups like church men that are very censorious on the right. But at K State, that doesn't seem to be a very dominant faction, like that specific like upper middle class group. So I mean, my students will argue with me, but I'm totally cool with that. And I also think it's because it's a black school, it's a little harder to tie race into things. I mean, I'm kind of light skinned, but I still very light skinned. I still hoop in the gym. I mean, like we're all black. So it's kind of when I was our ombudsman, for example, we'd frequently have it's called council. We'd have these sort of business meetings. And there's really no way to say, you know, the white man is responsible for something like a budget shortfall. It's 50 black guys in suits. So it's just, I mean, are we gonna make this payment or not? And that I think that eliminates one possible objection that could be made. So it's a black institution. It's a very normal school. It's a solidly mid-ranked institution. So I haven't encountered that much. Maybe I will. I don't know.
Lou?
We'll see.
I was,
Maybe next
I was
semester. You never know.
gonna say there has to be like, like one African guy you can blame it on, because that seems to be like
Blame it on the Nigerian.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
It's
Blame it on that
Nigerian
dude.
brother or something.
But will like the sort of like the characteristics of those schools like Oberlin that you discuss. I remember reading about when it comes to issues like safetyism, safe spaces, trigger warnings, the belief that it's okay to use violence to stop a speaker on campus. More than anything, it tends to be at these really expensive liberal arts institutions rather than the place, like you said, like with the football team. Because I think it was a while back you were talking about it was like all you need are some of those like frat bros to just get in there and just end this, the people like doing like the human shield outside of the building and stuff. You need some frat bros to be like, all right, chug a beer, take them and start tossing them.
Yeah. So the lies. Oh, were you going to say something?
Actually, just as a very brief response to that. I mean, like, I pretty much agree with that. I actually read something recently to like wonk out for a second, but I mean, like the whole trauma thing. Well, first of all, actually, this was on the Matt Walsh podcast, so I'm not gonna like pretend this was like deep academic literature, but like he read the article. I read the article like a week before. But there's a piece that found that people are now using the word trauma to describe like more and more things. Like it used to be associated with like 3 or 4 things, like car wrecks, like sexual and maybe physical assault, war was the big one that lasted the longest time, so on. And now people are using it to describe an example on social media the other day was a family buying someone a car they didn't want. And one of the predictors of people associating things with trauma was not actually having had traumatic experiences, which I think was actually pretty important. So, like, there's studies that look at how often you feel traumatized. And a big predictor of rarely feeling traumatized was having experienced actual trauma, like having been beaten by more than two people, which is just a fight, just being jumped. But I mean, even that would trigger it, like being shot at, being in a military conflict situation, domestic violence. So if you've experienced any of the classic trauma, which maybe even a generation ago, most people had, your girlfriend slapped you, you went to boot camp. I'm not endorsing this, but very common experiences, you would be less likely to associate normal, even more minor experiences with that sense of traumatic sensation. But anyway, like, I think the thing with the Oberlins and so on is that almost no one there, and I don't know what people's private situations, their mothers or fathers might be, but at least in day-to-day society, almost no one there has experienced shit in life. They're not having traumatic, difficult lives. These are some of the richest, most pampered people in society. I would hazard to say that's especially true for the minority kids there. Because I mean, you may encounter a little racism, but there's also this sort of affirmative action cushion you're on. If you're in a $300,000 a year, say, Black and South Asian family, and you're going to Oberlin, so there are going to be things that come out of that, and I think one of them is going to be an inability to distinguish between mild inconvenience and, say, actual violence. So that's where you get the blurring of these category lines. Like, when people say someone criticized Palestine, that's violence. That's not true. Like, if you've actually been smashed in the head with a beer bottle, like, you understand the distinction between violent, your husband throws you into a wall, someone snap kicks you in the head during a neighborhood fight. Like, you understand the difference between violence and someone saying, I don't like that random country that you're not from. But I think the places where that's less common are the places where you see more of a lack of understanding of that. And it's the graduates of those places that are doing things now, like putting trigger warnings on the Archie Bunker show. So, good point.
Well, which was funny. They shouldn't do that. Leave that show alone. So
But
I
they
want to
did.
go
They
through.
put trigger warnings on All in the Family. They put trigger warnings on the Jeffersons. Like, this show includes racial humor. Like, no shit. I mean,
Right.
it was the most astonishing thing. They triggered Archie and George. They had like the words over both their heads. I saw this the other day myself. It was just totally astonishing.
So I'm going to go through the lies because I want people to know what they are. I might stop at some of them and talk about them. The first one, lie number one, we talk about pretty often. So I'll just say what that one is. It's slavery, everywhere through history, but not brutal chattel. Slavery. So you're talking about slavery being everywhere. Number two, you alluded to that one earlier, so I want to talk about that one briefly. The Red Scare. So you talk about how McCarthyism was all about them finding creating ghost all over the place and just pointing out everyone being a communist. And you're very fair in the book, and you do both sides. So and you say, well, where they may be right about certain things, like yeah, there may have been some instances where they may have gotten it wrong or the approach may have been wrong. But let's not pretend that there were no commies. And so I have a question, and then I have one comment. So in your discussion, and you're talking about people, and you say there were a lot of communists. So you were mentioning some people, and you mentioned Dalton Trumbo, and it made me laugh because I don't know if you all remember. You went back and watched it again when you wrote about it in the book. So they did the movie with Bryan Cranston, and I remember that scene. So there's a scene at the beginning of the movie. I don't know if either of you have seen it, Lou and Christy. So he's obviously the blacklisted screenwriter who, he was a communist, so they blacklisted him. So he secretly wrote some screenplays and stuff. And so of course they paint him in the picture of being a good little communist. So he's got a young daughter, I don't know, maybe 12 or 13. So his daughter says, am I a communist? And he says, I don't know. And so he said, like, so let's say your mom makes you your favorite lunch, and you take it to school and you see a kid who doesn't have lunch. What do? Do you tell him to get a job? And the girl's like, no. Do you give him some and charge him 6% interest? No. What do? I share my sandwich with him. Well, there you go. Lou, you're a communist, right? And it's silly and weak writing for one. But the other thing that's funny is those aren't really the options, right? Aren't the options to say, well, that's sad. So let's be real. What would most people do? He didn't give her the option of, you say, wow, that's really sad. And then you don't bully him and you don't make fun of him, but you also don't give him your sandwich. You just eat it. So that's not one of the options, right? Or how about teasing them? Because that's what kids do. where I went to school, it would have been like Eddie Murphy. I got some ice cream and you want ice cream because your mama's a whipper. That really happened, right? So in that, that was the way they tried to frame him and a lot of other people. They were all doing good. And where there were bad things happening, they didn't know, right? The Rosenberg, they mentioned it, but it was like, they were innocent. It was all that kind of thing. So when you're writing about it, you're writing about the fact that it was true, that there were actual people, and you list them, what they actually did, selling secrets, the whole nine. So my question, and feel free to comment about how they're portrayed in Hollywood, but my question is, you fast forward, 60, 70 years, we may be in a worse situation. We may have fewer of them, but I want to ask the three of you, would they even have to conceal themselves? I mean, we literally have a party with elected officials called the Democratic Socialists of America. Right. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, jumping in first, you're being an honored guest this time. Well, first of all, I think you made a good point that and you made the point of the chapter, basically. I mean, for those watching and so on. Yeah, chapter 2 of the book, I make the point. The Red Scare was one of those things that irritated me because, again, it's presenting the ordinary view of the American, the ordinary working class, white ethnic guy in the North, black guy in the South, soldier, that there were a bunch of commies in the country, and you might not trust, Mr. Nixon, but you wanted the Reds out of the country. It's sort of some stupid, rubish shit. The New York Times reader didn't believe that. You knew that nice Ethel was innocent. No, the ordinary guy was correct. Like, the USA and the Russians had both larded up the other side's country with these damn spies. The USA was doing this too. I mean, we tried to give Fidel Castro this kind of pomade to make his beard fall out and also poison him a little bit. Another time we tried to kill him with an exploding cigar. This was the spy games era. Like, James Bond was pretty realistic. I mean, except for the girls and jet skis and so on. But the idea of guys in suits running around the world, like shooting at each other and delivering cases and all this stuff, I mean, that was pretty accurate. So the Russians were doing this as well. The Russians came from that long Slavic tradition of Maskarovka. They were arguably the best people in the world at it. And yeah, I mean, getting to the point, in political science, there's a series of decrypted documents called the Venona cables, which are communiques between the Russian government and their agents in the United States. And there's a lot of like hemming and hawing, and we haven't confirmed all this in political science, but young political scientists are often asked to work with these documents, and everyone kind of knows they're real. And one of the things they have in them is the identities and code names of the Russian agents in the United States. You can just go to Britannica or Wikipedia and look up Venona cables. And one of the things that we got out of this and out of a lot of other good research into Russian espionage during this period is the simple fact that, like, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were guilty as sin. Alger Hiss, 99 out of 100, guilty. Like, M. Stanton Evans wrote an entire book about this, where he just went through who all the Russian spies were. Came out in 2007, blacklisted by history. So the basic point was that most of the people, Dalton Trumbo was a communist. We've known this for at least 15 years. So not everyone, McCarthy had some lies on his list. McCarthy didn't even reveal one of his lists. But the large majority of the people who were accused of Russian espionage were Russian spies. It really is that simple. And there's been a huge kind of like block and tackle thing that's been going on for decades, where people on the left, some of whom are communists. I mean, Walter Duranty for the New York Times, some of their guys during the 1980s, these people were communists. People who are actual Reds were trying to prevent us from understanding that the people that were being attacked for being communists were spies. It's that simple.
Right.
Yeah,
Chrissy, I don't know what you're doing, but you're giving us vertigo because you're making the screen shake. Please.
I'm sorry. I'm writing, so I don't.
Maybe that's what they do in India. We don't do that here.
So,
I just wanted to jump in on that. One of the things that I absolutely hate is when people start, when they refer to it as like a witch hunt. The Red Scare, it was a witch hunt, and it's like, well, that analogy would work if there were actually witches. But there were actually communists out there.
Right.
And I'm glad you brought up like the Dalton Trumbo, because I think what people forget is like there was a time where to be a communist was to be a Stalinist for a lot of people. It's like you were on the side of Stalin, the same and what was it, the Molotov Ribbentrop treaty, whatever that that Stalin and Hitler had, where they weren't going to attack each other. There were a lot of communists at the time who did not want the United States to get into that war. And then when, Hitler broke it, they're like, okay, now we got to get into that war. So, they were going by whatever the Reds were, were dictating. And I had on my podcast, my friend, I don't know if you guys know Gene Epstein, but Gene has a really great biographical story about his mother. It's like his mother, he's like my mommy, the commie. His mother was a card carrying, red. And, and I asked him, I said, at the time, like, you know, did people not know that, what Stalin had done and all that? And he's like, you're giving them way too much credit. This idea that, that the evils that Stalin perpetrated were, somehow unknown to the American communists, is just kind of silly. And a lot of people hung on for a while because, the whole idea that the revolution was worth that. So I'm looking forward to reading that chapter in particular.
And anybody to the point that like the Democratic Socialists and what they would have to do today, do they have to conceal themselves or?
Yeah, I had something on that. I mean, Bernie Sanders is a, socialist Democrat who some would just say is just a socialist, So
Right.
I definitely think that there are parts of the, liberal side that no one would bat an eye if people started coming out as the communists that they are. But on the flip side, on the right, would have you believe that we're two steps from losing our country, that we're two steps from diving into communism or socialism.
Or a civil war, which is
Do you think
nonsense.
that is hyperbolic, or is there some truth to that, or is that going to be one of those, hyperbolic lies?
Lou, Will, what do you all think?
I
Well,
definitely want a civil war. I don't
No,
have.
she was out. I will get to the Civil War.
Oh,
Civil War is complete BS. It's not even physically possible, so that's just stupid. But and Will and I have talked about that before. But to the other point about losing to, what are they saying? Fall into communism, or just, America not ceasing to be what America is.
Right. Are we
well,
that close to it?
I don't think we're going to fall into communism per se. I actually think the West has some very serious problems right now. Like, I mean, looking around the country, there are a lot of major structural issues that, because they're closer to the dictatorship model, like ancient rivals like the Chinese and the Arabs don't have. I mean, I don't really think diversity itself is that big of an issue. Like, I think demographic change is one of those things that's really overhyped. I don't think we're going to have a civil war. So, first of all, like, I don't dislike Hispanic people in the first place. A lot of the stuff about immigration comes close to being just racism. But also, like, even if the most cold predatory approach that you take, the United States right now is the argument, I guess, on the alt right is that we've fallen. It's important to take this on directly. Is that we've fallen from being like 85% white to 61% white, and that could cause problems in sort of structural terms. We're becoming a majority minority country. The problem with that is that most Hispanics are Catholic Caucasians that identify as white. So, like, in political science, we would say that we're still 77% white. A lot of those people are just Hispanic.
Yeah, like that guy.
Like, well, I mean, like, Lou is Hispanic. I mean, like, and for that matter, like, I'm black. And I mean, like, I'm proud to be black and all that, but I'm clearly like 50 to 60% like Celtic and Indian. So it's just like, if you actually look at American demographics, we're 77% Caucasian, counting Hispanic Caucasians. We're 8% Asian, a group that's kicking everybody's ass. We're like 5% multiracial, which is mostly white and black, our two oldest groups. Like, a good question would be like, has our black group, which has traditionally been the group that's felt genuinely oppressed, has that group increased? And it's like, no, the blacks have been like 12% of the population, whatever.
Well, maybe if they stop.
Oh, yeah, we cut down on that violence. I mean, we could grow our population numbers. We could do it.
But and like, the abortion that, on the one end, the abortion on one end is shoot on the other end. That's an easy 6% right there.
We've got to work on it, big Chuck. But like the idea though that like the two groups that used to be almost at war with each other, like there's a major population difference. No, like we're getting basically Italians. Like we're getting Catholic guys from Cuba and Mexico. And we could stop that at any point by locking things down on the border, which we should also do. But I don't think that the major population changes are necessarily going to be a big deal. I think, though, beyond that, there are issues. Like among all races, like our fertility rate is like 1.5. And because people, especially males, do dumb shit early on and don't live forever, you need like 2.2 just to reproduce your country. Within society, we're doing all this crazy stuff, like teaching people that the country is evil. Climate change is going to kill you. There's like this doom saying where like 40% of people are in therapy. And we've seen this before with societies like late Rome and Angkor Wat that almost destroy themselves. So we've got to overcome that and get back to being like healthy and predatory, frankly.
Well, Christy, I think that's the better point to answer your question. The problem is it's not that the right is right, and it's not that they're wrong. It's a nuanced answer. Like Will said, there are problems. And if we continue on the path, things will get worse. And you may not be in America the way you remember it, right? But it doesn't mean the extremists who say, we're going to cease to be America. That's not the way the change will be. It'll still be a country. It'll still have a name. There'll still be states, right? There won't be a civil war. You'll just see a change, right? So the change is not as drastic as it doesn't mean that they're wrong because they're saying things could get worse and it can be a drastic difference. It just doesn't mean, when you say that, people envision the dystopian movies, right? The futuristic movies where everybody's, scrounging for food and all that kind of thing. It's not that. It just, you will just look around and notice, remember how you used to be able to do this and you can't do this, or it used to be that nobody was doing this and now everybody's doing it. And it just doesn't really feel like it's the best thing for the country, but on the fringes, the country's still there. So that's the deal. I think that's where we may be headed. Did that answer your question? I don't want to move on if you're not satisfied. So next, Will talks about Live 3. Native Americans were peaceful people who spent all day dancing. Right? They were just happy-go-lucky people watching Oprah, eating ice cream. Then along came Whitey and everything went bad. We all know that's not true. It's funny. A funny thing about that, I thought about you. Pretty soon we're going to go talk about that on another episode in detail. But, I've mentioned being on the school board here. We had a very contentious meeting last night. So because it was so crazy, and the superintendent was doing his report, I didn't even, normally I would have commented on it. So he's going through the thing, updates, good and bad. This is a wonderful things we've done. At the end, he says, and this is next year's school calendar, because this was the last meeting of the school year. So he said, this is next year's school calendar. He puts it up that he's talking about the schools close on this day. Then he says, we close on October 14th or whatever for Indigenous Peoples Day. Now, if I was in a normal circumstance and I wasn't in chaos, I would have said, any questions for the superintendent? Yeah, I'd like to know which federal holiday is Indigenous People Day. Yeah. Right. And what do the Black people do, since we're all about equity, whose family was walked on the trail of tears as slaves to Oklahoma and other areas? Are they supposed to celebrate the Native American Indigenous People Day, or what do they do? Since we're all talking about, my truth and all. But it's insane. If you want, like you want to debate something, you want to fight something, you want to change something, have the discussion, win the fight. But they just cheat. They don't even win. They just change. So no one, I don't remember. Did I miss that, Lou? Did I miss the Congress getting on the floor at AOC making the passionate speech where she talked like a sister and she shake her head and then it passes and they pass a law saying that it's no longer Columbus Day? Did I miss that? So they didn't change the holiday. They just decided they'll just change it on the paper. It didn't even say slash, like most calendars now say slash. Columbus Day slash, whichever one you do, whatever you want to celebrate. No, it was like Indigenous People Day. What? So that's the kind of change you'll see, Chrissy, just subtle little things like that. So that was Live 3. Live 4 was about the hippies. They were the good guys. The sexual revolution was great for women, and Vietnam War was unpopular and pointless, and everybody was in the streets screaming against it, which wasn't really true. Something I liked about that was, if you want to talk about that briefly, Will, about you quote some people who wrote about the time, who go back, just how both the sentiment in the community, especially in San Francisco and some in certain areas where they just that the people were dirty and vile, they wanted them out of society. You shouldn't be part of normal society because we had wanted nothing to do with you, and how the free love was really strikingly patriarchal. Oh, yeah, and also enabling underage sex, but that's side note.
Yeah, so chapter 4, I think, was one of the most entertaining and fun for me to write because a lot of this stuff as a social scientist I had known. Chapter 4, a feminist friend suggested, actually. I hadn't known some of that. But hippies were not widely liked in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, to say the least. Like one of the leading songs for 2 years in a row, Okie from Muskogee, is totally, to me, it's a little corny, but it's just basically about bashing hippies. And it's this old whiskey drenched country rocker singing things like, we don't make a party out of loving, and just criticizing the whole kind of long haired, weed drenched urban party scene. And that was very typical of an attitude that defined an entire era. I mean, there were multiple anti hippie riots that involved servicemen, that involved white guys, that involved black guys. You'd get beaten up in much of the South for having long hair. The Hard Hat Riot in New York City actually involved tens of thousands of both hippies and construction workers who brawled with each other for several days. Construction crews came in from nearby suburbs, marching behind American flags, chanting, USA all the way with baseball bats. Like that was the actual attitude toward hippies among urban whites and African Americans. If you asked about hippies, Aquarians, hip youth, the attitude toward them was often in the 8%, that sort of thing, positive. So, I mean, it's really interesting to look at that and then to see these hundreds of books, Our Golden Summer, this kind of thing with like Jimi Hendrix on the cover and these stone couples making out in the mud and so on. And it's just one of those interesting things. You realize that a movement doesn't survive unless it has kind of a chronicler. And I thought this about things I participated in my own life. There aren't a lot of chroniclers really to write about the 1990s rave scene, and there aren't a lot to write about things that I've seen just in passing, heavy metal or bass fishing or whatever. But because it was an upper middle class youth movement based on the big cities, there were a lot to write about the hippies. Like most people probably think that like folk music about revolution was the most popular music in the 1960s. It wasn't at all, as versus black music or rock or a dozen other things. Mm-hmm. That's something that came out of that era that survived because so many wealthy dentist daughters from Poughkeepsie have golden memories of Woodstock. So, I mean, that's just something I found interesting. Almost everyone despised the hippies, but there actually was a dark side beyond like the hippies and the construction workers fighting. Like a deep impression that I have as just like an ordinary center-right taxpayer looking at the stories of women who actually talked about the sexual revolution, like what it was like living in a hippie squat before there were really any rules. What it was like when people first started taking hallucinogenic drugs and women would pass out in fields for a day or two. And then people talking about other movements like anti-nuke and so on down the line. The prevailing impression that I got was that most of the stuff to come out of the 60s, other than basic black civil rights, was pretty bad. Like a lot of the later parts of the sexual revolution, the drug revolution, the eco-freako crap, and the anti-nuke movement, which in my mind has killed hundreds of thousands of people globally, a whole bunch of it, like the anti-war movement that lost us Vietnam and really made cowardice sort of mainstream for the first time. These sort of healthy young guys chanting nothing is worth dying for. And like all the rest of it, like the Black Radical Revolution, the Panthers, the Weathermen, the idea of domestic terrorism, the Monkey Wrench Gang. So like we think of the 60s as being all this together as one movement, like Martin Luther King and this. But those are really two very different things. There were these sort of citizens in suits marching and saying, we want to vote. And a lot of early feminism falls in that category too. And then there was all this other crap. And we've seen a lot of writing from the revolutionaries in that second camp trying to put these two together. And most of the other stuff is largely responsible for a lot of the negative things we see in society today. The anti-Vietnam War movement, by the way, I would tie into this negative camp as well. I'm not an expert on this field of history, but it strikes me that losing the Vietnam War was very negative and very avoidable. And this again gets into the basic point that communism existed in the real world as a threat during this entire era. Like it wasn't a boogeyman that our leaders made up to control youth revolution or to give people something to be scared of. The USSR and China, after the defeat of Nazi Germany, were the two other great powers in the world. These were nuclear powers, and these were something pretty close to slave states. And following the rise of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Germans, I mean, something like 35 countries, mostly unwillingly, including odd places like Madagascar, fell under sort of that communist yoke. Communism took over a good chunk of the world. And so the goal of the USA became sort of stopping the dominoes from falling, intervening in proxy wars and all of these random but important little countries to stop this existential threat to us from spreading. And that's why we were in Vietnam. But we had a problem on our home front, which the Russians were very aware of, and which they identified as sort of the fifth column they could use to beat us, which was homegrown radicalism, student protests, so on. The Arabs today feel the same way, by the way.
Right.
And in Vietnam, there was so much of this that we actually ended up pulling out of the war. And exactly what our generals thought would happen happened. I mean, like the North Vietnamese conquered South Vietnam, Saigon fell. I mean, not long after Cambodia fell. I mean, that's where the killing fields occurred, so on down the line.
Yep.
Yeah, Pol Pot took over, 4 million people died. So, I mean, I'm sure there are a few historical details I'm missing, but the negative scenario that was projected by the American center right is what occurred. Like,
well, let me ask you one other quick thing, though, since you mentioned that. You mentioned the weathermen, and it made me think about it because recently somebody, I think last year I was reading it because somebody suggested it was a pretty good book, Days of Rage. How many people do you think know about all the bombings in the late 60s and the early 70s?
Almost none. That's something that I was going to talk about in the book. I mean, when you write for a major publisher, as most of you guys know, they're gonna cut out some stuff, edit some stuff. But I mean, like that when people were talking about January 6th and they were saying this is the worst day in the country's history, first of all, they killed Martin Luther King. They shot John F. Kennedy in the head. Just shut up.
And seven presidents.
They killed presidents. They shot Malcolm X. I mean, just shut up. They killed Abraham Lincoln. But I mean, like, even aside from that, like, you know, I like Honest Abe, but okay, you can say, well, this was a battle, a cop was killed. Okay. Even if you just mean days in Congress, that's not true. Like you, Charles, you're absolutely right. Like the Weathermen, the original, I think, Stormfront, the Puerto Rican guys, what is Sendero Luminicio or whatever? I could have gotten that wrong. But like these groups. Felon, yeah. But I mean, these groups, thank you. But like these people, like there were snipers in Congress at various points. This was an era of extreme terrorism. In fact, I'm not too sure. I believe the official stories on who killed Kennedy and King, but we don't need to get into that right now. Like assassinations were extremely common.
Right.
Political figures were.
They cut that chapter out of the book for sure.
No, I didn't say that. I wasn't like,
the Seinfeld episode, right?
I wasn't just naming CIA agents or whatever. No, I mean the point though is that yes, there was a period of assassination and a period of extreme terrorism during this era. I mean, the Weathermen were a terrorist group. Bernadine Dorn, all of these people, I'd put the Manson family in this category, although in a less organized fashion. Who is it? Bill Ayers. I mean, these people were organized semi-professional terrorists. I mean, bombs full of nails were winding up in politics.
And they're all professionals now. Angela Davis, you know.
Yeah. It's the craziest thing. Who's the one in Chicago? Who's the professor in Chicago?
Oh, Ayers? Was that Bill Ayers?
It may be fucking Bill Ayers. I've met him. Like my mom was a well-respected teacher. She was an inner city teacher. And like I've gone to functions where one of these guys was. And he's a charming guy. It's just it's like it's not quite like meeting Osama bin Laden. It's like meeting Osama bin Laden's second guy. But like by this point, like I was aware of who he was, I guess. And it was just it's an extremely unusual situation. Right. I'll just leave it there. But yeah, like many of these people were professional terrorists for very long stretch. Yeah, and I'm pretty sure that's the guy. Many of these people were very professional terrorists for very long periods of time. The 60s and 70s were full of this kind of activity. And yes, then people just move forward. And by the way, fictional narratives grew up around a lot of this. So there's a story of, I believe it's Move in Philadelphia, where a common explanation is the police attempted to chase and attack black radicals. They dropped bombs on this innocent home where they were doing urban farming. They killed these people. The people in question were stockpiling oil and probably explosives on top of a series of row houses. And so basic police flashbangs set this off and destroyed an entire city block. Like this was a time when there were these armed revolutionary groups in the country putting together pretty serious arsenals. And yeah, we kind of just moved on from that.
Right. Well, I know we're running short, so I got to just at least tell us what some of the others are. You talk about the 3/5 lie, blacks being 3/5 of a person, which is stupid and annoys me. You talked about European colonialism, which is good. Obviously, we had Bruce Gilley on, so we covered some of that stuff before, but you go into detail on that. You know, one of the things they ignore is what life was like in these places before colonialism, and the natives who lived through it, who talked about the good things that came from it, but no one talks about that. You talk about Americans' use of nukes and how they say we were evil and it's justified. It kind of made me think about your post about recently about the Israeli hostages. It's like, well, everybody freaked out and said, well, how many innocents? What's the number of innocents you can kill to free for hostages, right? So it's kind of like that same thing. There's nothing you should do. Every life is equal to every other life. So you're like, no, exactly. So, that kind of, will fall into what they're saying about nukes. Unprovoked white flight caused by pure racism. And you talk about how there's other things like busing, affordable housing, higher incomes, highways. I don't know, crime. One I wish you'd mention, because I was waiting for you to mention, was, I thought about Detroit and what do they call it, Hell's Night. How about burning the city on a regular basis? Maybe that make you move when there's scheduled fires. We're going to go and burn hundreds of fires or something. And then the last one is the Southern strategy, how racism turned the solid South Republican. And one thing I want to mention to that is that while you make a great case on it, it's obvious, and you point out how they say, yeah, they make this, but 1964, they lose, they say they're going to do this, and then all of a sudden, all the Democrats, those racists, they're now Republicans. It's like, so outside of Reagan, Jimmy Carter won the South, but you say he's from Georgia, he didn't have to win every other state. But the House and the Senate didn't really change, right? And I think it was even slower than you say. I think in the book you say in 94 was when the first time the Republicans had gotten the majority of the South. And I looked up Congress, and I got a heat map that I want to share. Let's see if I can do this real quick. Boop. And here. So this is, tell me if you can see. See the map, Christy?
Now I do.
All right, so this is the Senate in 1993, the 103rd Congress. So they got Mississippi and North Carolina, right? And then you got, so really they didn't even have the majority of the South then until 2001. In 2001, they had all of these states except for one. I can't remember which one. And then when Reagan won, he won every state, but they only had Virginia. That was the one state. And then even if you look here, that's in the Senate. In the House, well, they got Florida. The other ones are split. So if the South had become so right wing, why couldn't they win a House seat for 40 years? No one knows that. About as many people know that as they do that 3/5 is BS, or that there were people going around the country blowing people up. Last thing, the book is great. They should buy. Last thing I want to say, Will, is that if they enjoy the podcast, they'll enjoy the book. I don't know if this is easy or hard. That's my last question. In a sense, I think it may be easy because you're doing what you normally do. But as I read the book, you write in your own voice. So I wonder, is that hard in the sense that when it gets to editing, I'm sure when you write and it flows, you write the way you write. But the tongue-in-cheek comments, the sarcasm, the abbreviation of the way you say it's the way you actually talk. And you would think some editor would be like, well, we got to take that out. No one's going to know what that is. So how was that part, making it sound like you sound?
A lot of it's just relaxed confidence. By this point, I mean, I've written 4 books. 3 of them have been bestsellers, at least on Amazon temporarily. So, I mean, if the editor sends back a lot of edits, I'll change, a third of them or whatever. No. It was pretty easy to do that. But I mean, the editors that I worked with, all the people that I worked with, Eric Nelson, to shout him out, Hannah Long, Teresa Dooley over at HarperCollins and Broadside were pretty great. I mean, it was an enjoyable experience. There was no real hostility or anything like that. So yeah, I mean, I was it was fun.
Lou, what do you think the impact of if he could get these people to read these lies? Do you think people will be open enough to say, okay, maybe he's right, or will they just say he's a right wing racist, so of course he would say that?
Well, I think this type of material does really well on like YouTube. Like there's a while where you would put in the truth about X or whatever. And I think there are a lot of people who are hungry for books that debunk, for books that call into question this stuff. And I think I mean, if there is when I'm thinking about kids, if there's a rebellious streak among them where they legit want to, you have like a young red-pilled kid or, who wants to, challenge their teacher. I think, a book like this could definitely help out.
And Christy, they're never going to put the book in school, unfortunately, but someone has to write these books. So when you look for the information, it's out there, right?
You know what I'm looking for is I'm going to be looking on social media because there's this whole dust up among Charlie Kirk or Jack Persobo where he said these same things about slavery. And all of a sudden, all of the pundits, especially the Black conservative pundits, are calling them racist and have been really down their necks. Or like when DeSantis alluded to the fact that slavery wasn't all bad. I don't know if you guys remember this dust up. And they were just really on him.
Tuesdays were pretty rough, though. I remember slavery on Tuesday was pretty intense.
Yeah, but they were really on him. I mean, really, slavery. I felt like reading this and Will starting with it, like you wanted all the smoke because you started with the hot button issue. So I bet you Charlie Kirk is going to be quoting you like, see, even the Black guy said that I'm right. And so I'm looking for that dust up.
Have you been on Charlie Kirk show yet?
No, if I go on Charlie Kirk's show, I mean, I'm gonna, point out that his launching a summer campaign based around attacking Martin Luther King is pretty dumb. He's going for the black vote. Yeah, I mean, I think there are two things here. Like, and this is actually I'm actually arguing right now with Diane Yap on Twitter about
I saw that.
Yeah, like the dissident right racism. So, I think that there's an interesting balance here because almost everything the left says is a lie. But it's also true that most things the extreme right says aren't true. So it's a weird mix. Like I've been asked a bunch of times, like, well, what's something is crazy that one of the Christian churches says as gender ideology? And it's like, well, the world's 6,000 years old. And I'm obviously not all Christians advance that. But my basic point as a writer is, well, there are things that are true that are often pretty easy to point out. And here's my take on what those are. Now, because I'm from the right, most of my books come from the right and look at things from the left, which I think are much more prevalent, kind of mainstream, sort of upper middle class discourse today. Like you don't see a bunch of preachers holding parades down the center of major city streets arguing that the world is 6,000 years old and big flags that say 6K hanging from the front of the White House and so on. But I mean, the basic idea that the truth is a concept to be...
do you see on the White House, Wilfred?
I mean, mostly ones representing all kinds of sexual kinks. I mean, it's the pride flag. The last pride flag I saw in the White House had the red umbrella, which I think is whores. Sex workers would be a better label. But I mean, so you gotta get that. You gotta get them in there. Intersex people were in there.
Don't leave out the hoes, Will. Don't leave out the hoes.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a weird. One of the things about therapy culture and all this other stuff is that if you commodify oppression and you keep adding oppressed categories and you give them all the same value as being a recent Mexican immigrant or something like that, you're going to wind up in a situation where almost everyone is oppressed. Hey, I'm Black, my ancestors, lost the Caucasians, were slaves for 100 years. What's your deal? I'm a slut. I mean, I think eventually people are going to start saying, well, I don't really feel your pain anymore. And we're just going to go back to judging people as individuals. So hopefully that happens soon. And that's one of the points of my book, Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me.
The book is one way to do it. I hope you buy 4 and pass them out. Oh, 5. I'm sorry, 5. Correct, 5. Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me by the great Wilfred Reilly. Well, thanks for coming on and slumming with us and discussing the book. God bless the US of A, land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to save, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving a day.